Hey, so my name is Kaarle Wirta and I'm a PhD candidate from Leiden University. Today I'm going to talk briefly about my PhD dissertation titled Dark Horses of Business, Overseas Entrepreneurship in the 17th Century Nordic Trade in the Indian and Atlantic Ocean. The whole idea behind this talk today is that although I don't explicitly use a sort of global historical framework for my PhD dissertation, I do still find very fitting and sort of quite on point to the type of things that the Global History Laboratory is working with. Mainly because I'm basically looking at how business was developed in the sort of overseas context and in Europe, in the Atlantic Ocean and Indian Ocean. So in itself, the whole perspective, the whole approach is global. The focus for the 17th century comes from the fact that while I was sort of consulting the research literature and the sources for the type of research that has been done in the Nordic context regarding overseas trade, one thing really struck me. And the thing was that how international it was from the get-go. Now, there are some issues with the historiography at present, and one of the issues is that we historians have not focused that extensively on the early years of the Nordic overseas trade, and this has partly to do with the fact of lack of sources, but then there are still sources, so it's not the full explanation of the story. But also the other part of the story is probably just a simple fact that at the very early stage, the concept of the Nordic overseas business was rather modest, especially in comparison to scale from, for example, the Dutch West India and East India companies, or the English for that matter. So, and I also realized while working on the background research for my topic was that actually in the international historiography, it's not that known. Actually, very little is known about the Nordic overseas expansion. So this was basically the starting point for the whole research. And what really struck me was that how many individuals pop up in the sources. You find names that you have never heard of, and I was wondering, we are so much far back in time in history. How is it possible that we know so little about these people, although so much is about them in the sources? In the get-go, I was thinking about how to fit into the larger framework of the full research project in which I was involved with, which is the Challenging Monopolies, Defying Empires, which is the project under the supervision by Katja Antunes with the European Research Council grant. I realized that so much work can be done within this topic, within this framework. My background is more from a African historian point of view, from looking at sociology and history, that sort of things. But slowly I started to realize that actually what takes place in the Nordic context is a lot of these sort of international exchanges, and especially in regards to business, especially between Dutch entrepreneurs and the Nordic states. Now, while I started to work doing research literature, I quite quickly saw that what really pops up in the sources are the names of these individuals who are part of establishing and coordinating and developing the early Nordic overseas expansion. And this sort of started to make me to focus more on the people involved in developing these businesses. I was wondering, who wants to be a part of building Nordic overseas expansion? And that was sort of the get-go. That was the initial starting point for my research. And quite quickly I realized that my approach is not necessarily that much from the traditional historiography on European overseas expansion, which is then focusing on companies or larger trading networks and how sort of competing companies contested against each other. And in that framework, of course, then the Nordic companies fits also quite poorly because they are so much smaller in scale. Now, talking about scale was something that really struck me. I went on a more narrow scale for every week I worked on the early stage of the project, to the point that I realized that what I really want to study are these individuals. I got really curious about why do you see at the same time similar type of people working both in the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. And reading also the older sort of Danish historiography, I also realized this same happened in the Arctic waters when it comes to the question of whaling trade. So I got this sense of feeling that there's a type of a business model, a type of a business cloud that was working and trying to develop Nordic overseas trade. But the one thing that was common, both whether you were looking at the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic, is the fact that very few of these people were actually Nordic themselves. They were from German origin, from Portuguese origin, but especially from Dutch origin. And that was sort of the initial starting point from where that was where I started to hypothesize for the type of research that I wanted to do. So the research developed into more micro-historical approach. I really wanted to go narrow to the sources to look at who these people were, where they came from, why did they get interested in the Nordic overseas trade, why didn't they continue working with the bigger Dutch or the English companies. And this was sort of I really wanted to get close to the sources, because also in the historiography it has been quite striking how these individuals has been described earlier. They've always been described through this sort of national framework, and which is of course natural, because the scholar has been interested in studying whatever company, whether the Dutch West India Company or the English East India Company or the Danish East India Company for that matter. But there's always been this certain approach of looking at them through a sort of a framework that fits more to the story of what is a Swedish Africa Company, what is a Dutch West India Company, and that sort of things. But I realized that that's not necessarily the approach I want to choose, because we give them easily labels. If we look them through sort of larger structures, we give them labels as adventurers or pirates or traitors even. I've seen this in the sources or in the historiography. So I want to take a different approach. I wanted these individuals to talk for themselves, sort of try to find, is there something that commonly denominates these people, whether they are working in the Atlantic or Indian Ocean. So this was sort of the starting hypothesis. I realized that they were working with business, they were developing it, so I started to slowly read also about literature regarding entrepreneurship, and especially literature regarding early modern entrepreneurship. And quite quickly I figured out that what these individuals, and mostly they are men, although women are of course very important in this larger sort of social structure in which the agency and this behavior of these men was embedded. Now, the way they behave is rather entrepreneurial. They are willing to defy a risk. They take the leap of faith and challenge the great uncertainties. I mean, during the time period, everything from the sailing conditions to the medical conditions, from all kinds of diseases and illnesses, shipwrecks, pirates, sort of sailing in the same waters as these businessmen. I realized that they are really quite a category that we don't really know that well. We know the bigger capitalists who invest in war-making industries. We know quite well the stories of the initiators of the first Dutch West India companies and English East India companies, and who invested big amounts of money. But what about the men who worked on the spot? The men who actually coordinated and operated these big firms, not sitting comfortably behind their desks in Copenhagen or Stockholm, Amsterdam or London for that matter, but actually who did the sort of dirty job. So that was what I really got interested about these characters. Why are they so willing to defy all these great risks and uncertainties in order to build trade? Now, quite quickly I realized that they come from a certain cloud of people. They have a certain type of background. They are not necessarily the highest in the social strata, but they are also not at the very lowest bottom. So there is some sort of an in-between category. And that was sort of what I tried to sort of toy with in my theory for the dissertation, is that this microhistory from a global point of view, related in business field, and then from an in-between category, rather than looking from the very top-down perspective or from the bottom-up perspective. Because these two sort of scales, the bottom-up and the top-down, we do recognize these from the historiography. But what about these very sort of practical characters, these in-between people? And that was sort of the theoretical framework and sort of conceptual approach, sort of looking at entrepreneurship in an overseas context rather than in a European context. Because this is the other sort of conceptual challenge of the thesis, is simply the fact that when we look at the history of entrepreneurship, especially for the early modern period, we are predominantly still working within European structures, within European framework of geography or analysis. But what I started to realize that these men were using different mechanisms than in Europe. And this comes partly from the larger sort of sort of social structures in which they were working with, and that comes from the overseas world, because different challenges, different sort of processes were taking place than in Europe. So I basically set out in the dissertation to ask, what is overseas entrepreneurship? What were the mechanisms and backgrounds for this type of entrepreneurship, and what can we learn from using such a concept as overseas entrepreneurship? So I basically categorized 5 thematic chapters around this concept, where I was investigating what this sort of concept could mean and how could we historians use it. Now, overseas entrepreneurship for me is something that is a combination of many overlapping characteristics, which together comes into this whole idea of overseas entrepreneurship. Firstly, it's very important to look at the individuals' backgrounds. Where do they come from? What type of education do they have? Because whether I look at my Indian Ocean cases or my Atlantic cases, very similar things happen. They have some sort of an education. They are necessarily not in the highest sort of positions in the social structures of whatever society where they come from, but they are capable for bookkeeping. They are capable of reading, and what is more important than anything is that they are very good with languages. They are, whether it's Dutch language or Portuguese, which are the 2 lingua francas in overseas trade from the European point of view for this time period. The men are capable of working with these languages. German is of course, when you are working in a Nordic context, also very important. So language skills, writing skill, bookkeeping skills are important. Now, these are all characteristics which are of course possible to develop and learn in Europe. But when we move overseas, these individuals can't just sort of sail themselves and find and learn, do things. They need to be a part of some sort of a structure which helps them, which teaches them all these things. And that's where the Dutch companies comes in. Especially for the initiators of the Nordic companies, you see that they are all educated in Dutch companies, whether it's the West India companies or the West-Indische Compagnie or Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, which is then the VOC, the East India Company, you see that the men who initiate the Nordic companies, they are educated in the Dutch companies. It would not surprise me if the same would apply for the initiators of the first French and English companies. In fact, for the French, I know that in the Atlantic context at least, also the Dutch companies have been sort of serving as a platform, of educational platform for these men. So you can definitely tell that the individuals working initiated in Nordic companies, they have skills which are required to do merchant activities, but not all of them are just sort of independently growing in Europe, but they have to actually get the learning from somewhere, and this is where Dutch companies comes in. And that's why all the characters involved in my PhD thesis have a Dutch company background. Now, being said that there's a background before they come initiate Nordic companies, another thing that really characterizes them is that the men working in overseas trade can't function without the company. So the company framework in the Northern European context is crucial. Of course, this doesn't mean that all global trade in the early modern period was done through companies. We know the examples from Portugal, we know the examples from Italy, from Spain, and then of course all the non-European actors and agents. But from a Northern European perspective, and especially from a Nordic perspective, the company framework is the primary vehicle that does operate the entire connection between Europe and the overseas world. However, what I saw in the sources and in my dissertation is that, in fact, we should be quite careful when we talk about these early Nordic companies as sort of a corporate bodies and sort of large organizations that take care of these sort of large transcontinental transactions. In fact, I would oppose this argument and state that it is actually the individuals who really are the crucial players in this world. It is because there are so few people in the Nordic companies who have been abroad, or especially in the overseas context, who are actually capable of doing this type of business that is required, whether you are in India or in China or in the Caribbean or in West Africa. And this comes from the simple fact that these individuals who are trained by Dutch companies, they have been on the spot, they have been on the ground. They have learned the local trading patterns, cultures, rhythms. They have the social connections. They understand how competition between Europeans tends to appear in a local perspective. So this is something that is very crucial. And in a research chapter of mine, I really look at this, how these individuals acting as entrepreneurs actually takes care of the company business. So in contrast to what usually or generally is assumed of entrepreneurs being sort of self-employed, independent actors who don't need sort of any other sort of company frameworks, this doesn't apply, at least in the overseas context, because it is based on the charters, the privileges that the companies receive from the rulers in Europe, whether it's Queen Christina of Sweden or Christian IV in Denmark. It is this sort of political framework, political shelter that these companies need to be able to operate, whether it's in Asia or in the Atlantic. But still, the day-to-day business is taking care of the individuals, and that's what really sets the mark for the type of entrepreneurship that we need to understand when we're talking about especially the 17th century Nordic companies. But I would not be surprised if this would be the case also elsewhere. No, so they take care of the transactions, the daily business practices. They read the weather. They write the reports. They build the connections. They are sort of taking care of a very big part of the trade, quite independently. Of course, they have many people who are assisting them, but these key individuals who are sort of acting as commanders or merchants or head merchants or governors, they are very crucial for this type of a trade, and that actually shows. Through my dissertation, that the people involved in the overseas business for the 17th century, especially from a Nordic perspective, is a quite small group of people. So we are not looking at massive corporations with hundreds and hundreds of employees. Actually, we are looking at very small numbers, maybe everything from 5 to 70 is a quite big number for a Danish company. And of course, it changes over time and in space. We have a case from mid-1640s in India where the company commander, Willem Lale, is complaining that they only have 10 European employees in the company. So that actually tells quite a lot about the scale of these companies. And that's why perhaps it is better to talking about sort of individual companies rather than really massive conglomerate sort of state-owned enterprises, although the kings are important in both Swedish and the Danish companies. Now, said something about the local conditions. What really struck me in the thesis and regarding overseas entrepreneurship is also the aspect of social structures. Now, of course, business is done through transactions and exchanges of goods and products and that sort of things. But what really struck me was the social connections on the ground. We have a tendency still in history to look at social networks as something very positive, something that develops coherence, something that develops trust and fights uncertainties and combats risks. And these are the sort of typical topics for business history. But in fact, I can't say that my research confirmed these arguments. To the contrary, my research, both for the Atlantic case and for the Indian Ocean case, shows that the social relationships are also a part of the same sort of competition that from a larger framework also the European companies face themselves with. What I mean with this is that these individuals are very willing to change affiliations. They are very willing to change loyalty whenever it somehow fitted or improved their social positioning within the company framework or in the eyes of the local, the non-European rulers or merchants, or for the European rulers for that matter. So the point is that when I look at the sources, the type of research what I've been doing, going really close to the letters and reading what they describe about trust and who you can trust and who you can't trust and what are the reasons behind whether you are trusting or not trusting, you quite quickly see that this whole aspect of trust and building coherence is a part of a game, because the distances to Europe from the ground are so far and so vast that the board of directors in Europe, whether you are in Stockholm or Copenhagen, they have no idea what is actually going on the ground. So the social connections that I've seen through the sources are actually full of rivalry and tension. Even at the cases where the main head of merchants say, for example, that I have this trustworthy merchant working for me and this is the only one I can to appoint as an acting governor because I can't trust anyone else. The next day, these same people who they've trusted betray them for another network and for another potentate, for another ruler. And this is really challenging and makes the very nature of social relationships in the overseas context on the ground very chaotic. And this is definitely what it was. So actually, looking at social relationships, they should be looked as instruments to try to improve your own position. But you have to also be very willing to change your affiliation, to change your loyalty almost overnight, because this is the same type of a game that everyone else was involved with. Now this makes, for me, the conclusion that building social networks overseas, which requires reciprocity and some forms of trust, is quite difficult to support as an argument, because my cases actually show that it's almost the opposite. Now, if you look at the way these individuals, the commanders, the head merchants, the people, the individuals who I observe through the conceptual framework of overseas entrepreneurship, if we actually look at what ways and mechanisms they use in the letters, in the writing to the company directors in Europe, this whole issue of social connections, business practices, education, and all this comes alive. So I have a chapter in my thesis which is about the importance of knowledge from overseas trade. Now this is not only about understanding what sort of goods were desired, where and for what prices, and of course these are all important aspects. But actually I wanted to go a little bit deeper into this aspect, and I wanted to look at how the whole aspect of producing reports, producing letters becomes a tool in itself to demonstrate, almost as to use the word discourse, to show that you have means to take care of the business. You actually start to portray yourself as a very important person for the company. And you are doing this at a cost of all the other. What I explained really show is that overseas entrepreneurship consists of these 5 cornerstones. You have the background, the education of these people. That comes from experience from previous, be working in the overseas context. That is very crucial. Secondly, the aspect of working as an entrepreneur, but within a company framework. And this comes from its time. It comes from the 17th century mercantilist sort of trading world where privileged and charter-based companies were existing and the predominant form of doing business from a Northern European point of view. So working as an entrepreneur within a company was the only way for these individuals to sort of climb up the professional ladder. Now the third aspect is then the social connections. But instead of focusing on social connections, something building coherence, my PhD actually shows that in the business world, in the overseas world, because the information flows were so irregular, we actually see the opposite. That there's a lot of tension and rivalry within the company employees themselves, which makes the whole idea of working with social relationships important, but not from a coherence point of view, but rather from a very fragile point of view. And that's why many of these individuals were quite go-it-alone terms of way of people, because there was not many people they could trust. And then information showing really the importance of having knowledge from the overseas world, because that was truly a competitive advantage for these individuals. If they were the ones to control the information distribution to Europe, they were the ones who got to decide what information was provided, both from their allies, but also competitors from the ground. So this information and information distribution knowledge is definitely one of the key and cornerstones of overseas entrepreneurship. And then finally, violence. Because in European entrepreneurship, often violence is considered as something not welcome, something that creates more risks and uncertainty. But looking from an overseas perspective and through the perspective of these individuals, violence was a means for entrepreneurship. It gave an opportunity, a possibility to make quick profit through seizing ships, for example, or attacking villages or forts or whatever. But it could also have a long-term plan. It could give them a sort of a social status that was admired in Europe because they were capable of not only doing business, but also maintaining violence as a means to defend the positions that has been accumulated. So these are the 5 cornerstones of overseas entrepreneurship, and these are this is the concept that I suggest that historians could work with more elaborately in the future, and this is my contribution to the field.